Our current world is a place full of information. The internet is a part of our everyday lives. In this world of information and social media, we may find ourselves asking, how did we get here? I will try and answer that question and more by exploring the culture around Web 2.0, the Californian ideology, and their impact on technology. It all started in the 1960s in Northern California. Richard Barbrook and Andy Cameron cover the cultural and economic ideas behind the Californian ideology in their essay of the same name. They note how hippies in the Bay Area led a political and cultural movement called the New Left. Whereas the left had typically been more rigid, the New Left, as Barbrook and Cameron put it, quote, created collective and democratic structures which supposedly prefigured the libertarian society of the future, end quote. At the same time, a counter-movement called the New Right was on the rise. The Independence Hall Association describes the New Right as, quote, a combination of Christian religious leaders, conservative business bigwigs who claimed that environmental and labor regulations were undermining the competitiveness of American firms in the global market, and fringe political groups, end quote. Barbrook and Cameron cover Bloody Thursday, a direct violent clash in 1969 between these two conflicting ideologies. Ronald Reagan, at the time governor of California, had ordered a police crackdown on New Left protesters in People's Park, right by UC Berkeley. It quickly turned violent and left an image that these two ideologies could never mesh and would lead to even more conflict and violence in the future. This brings us to the 1970s. Soon, the hippie movement began to fade, but Barbrook and Cameron note how, quote, West Coast radicals became involved in developing new information technologies for alternative press, community radio stations, homebrew computer clubs, and video collectives, end quote. The idea behind this was that technology would be the path toward direct democracy. The New Left had now changed its focus to activism and technology. This is where the hacker culture comes in. Alice E. Marwick, in her book Status Update, describes how, quote, the political philosophy of hackers is often summarized as information wants to be free, a phrase that emphasizes openness and transparency. She also describes the homebrew computer club of the Bay Area and how it was, quote, organized around principles of information sharing, exploration, decentralization, and meritocracy, precisely the values of the hacker culture and later the ideals of Web 2.0, end quote. With the hacker culture, we are able to see the marriage of the New Left and the New Right that had previously believed to be impossible. Hackers took the libertarian capitalism and government deregulation from the right and utopian collectivism from the left. Louis Rossetto, in rebuttal of the Californian ideology, summarizes this perfectly as, quote, crucial left-right fusion of free minds and free markets, end quote. These ideas of capitalism and free markets continued into the 1980s. Before moving on, though, the punk movement should be briefly covered. Punks took the anti-corporatism of the New Left to a new level. Marwick notes how, quote, DIY cultural production of music, writing, or art was an explicit act of political resistance. Listening to bands on independent labels was an overt rejection of corporate media. Writing a zine was a way to express viewpoints absent from the majority culture, end quote. The Barnard Zine Library describes zines as, quote, self-publications motivated by desire for self-expression, not for profit, end quote. Punks were creating their own publications to represent the viewpoints they held that they knew wouldn't be represented in the mainstream media. This DIY attitude shares many parallels with the hacker culture and will come up again later. Now on to the 1980s. Sean P. Cunningham, in his article titled New Right, described Ronald Reagan as the New Right's iconic hero. As president during most of the 80s, Reagan is perfectly representative of the economic ideology that allowed Northern California to thrive. Northern California experienced economic prosperity as capitalist influences further moved the hacker movement to commercial technological development, especially within the software industry. Rossetto notes how, quote, the engine of development of the digital revolution was free capital markets and venture funds which channeled savings to thousands upon thousands of companies, enabling them to start and the successful to thrive, end quote. The hacker culture ideal of free information took on a whole new meaning with the spread of the internet in the 1990s. This is where it all starts to come together. In the past, anti-corporate leftists, punks, and anybody else with non-mainstream viewpoints had to self-publish their ideas in order to reach an audience. Now with the internet, users could post their ideas and reach huge audiences. This is where webzines and bloggers come into play. Marwick notes how many print zines went on to use electronic communication to reach their audiences, eventually going to use, quote, pictures, audio, and graphic design, end quote. Marwick continues, quote, eventually the early independent webzines petered out or turned into blogs, end quote. Blogs, however, didn't have the same anti-corporate feel as the previous formats, as users were dependent upon internet service providers to host and distribute the information. Still, the activist culture and the ideas of spreading alternative viewpoints underlay blogs and contributed directly to the ideas surrounding Web 2.0. Another interesting development in the 90s was the cyberdelic movement. Timothy Leary calls cyberpunks, quote, the counterculture of the electronic age, end quote. Leary continues that the idea behind the movement is to use information technologies to bring people together and communicate. Marwick goes even further to describe the desire, quote, to tap into cyber consciousness, end quote. These ideas are closely tied to many of the ideas held by the hippies in the 60s relating to community and the idea of a greater consciousness. The manifestation of the cyberdelic movement is the Burning Man Festival, held annually in the Nevada desert. The organizers of the event describe how the culture values, quote, art, communal effort, and innumerable individual acts of self-expression, end quote. Marwick goes on to say that, quote, Burning Man is a physical representation of Web 2.0 principles of openness, collaboration, and self-expression, end quote. The common thread between bloggers and cyberdelic idealists is their desire to draw together a sense of community and facilitate the spread of ideas. Many software developers involved in Cyberdelia and Burning Man incorporated these ideals into their work developing internet communication technologies or social software. Meanwhile, back on the capitalist side of the spectrum, the dot-com bubble was beginning to form. Kalen Smith, in his article, History of the Dot-Com Bubble Burst and How to Avoid Another, describes how many new companies began to join the software industry with hopes of taking advantage of the new form of commerce and communication that the internet provided. Quote, however, entrepreneurs' over-optimistic expectations of the potential of the internet created the infamous dot-com bubble, end quote. This brings us to the 2000s and the burst of the bubble. Smith describes how many of these dot-com companies were unsuccessful and crashed at the expense of the investor. Marwick describes how in the wake of the dot-com burst, the Bay Area technology sector was constructed under the idea of Web 2.0. Central to Web 2.0 were the ideas of, quote, the web as a platform, collective intelligence, data openness, iterative software development, rich user experience, and software as a service, end quote. Web 2.0 brought together the long-held ideas that created and bound the web together. The ideas behind Web 2.0 and the cultures that shaped them continue to live on today and will forever shape our technological world.